Hey, it's TuriType here, and these are my perspectives on introversion and extroversion from a more Jungian angle this time than the MBTI. Okay, so the aim of this video is just to assist people in understanding introversion and extroversion, at least from my perspective. So this is no more than my interpretation of Jung's work. I'll just get into it then. Introversion and extroversion. Of introversion and extroversion, Jung stressed that every individual possesses both mechanisms, and the only way to distinguish one from another is the observation of the attitude that prevails most of the time. So what he said was, one mechanism will naturally predominate, and if this condition becomes in any way chronic, a type will be produced. That is, an habitual attitude in which one mechanism predominates permanently, although the other can never be completely suppressed since it is an integral part of the psychic economy. Hence, there can never be a pure type in the sense that it possesses only one mechanism with the complete atrophy of the other. A typical attitude always means merely the relative predominance of one mechanism. This is to say, nobody is completely introverted or completely extroverted. They still possess the opposing mechanism, and a type is only produced when one attitude is predominant. I also interpret Jung here as suggesting that most people, most of the time, are somewhere in between the two extremities of introversion and extroversion. Introversion and extroversion should then be seen as a push and pull dynamic. It's not unlike the pumping action of pistons in an engine. This idea is evidenced in the following, where he says, "The one sees everything in terms of his own situation, the other in terms of the objective event." These contrary attitudes are in themselves no more than correlative mechanisms, a diastolic going out and seizing of the object, and a systolic concentration and detachment of energy from the object seized. Every human being possesses both mechanisms as an expression of his natural life rhythm, a rhythm which goeth surely not by chance, described physiologically in terms of the heart's activity. Of the introverted attitude, Jung says, but in general, one could say that the introverted standpoint is one which sets the ego and the subjective psychological process above the object and the objective process, or at any rate seeks to hold its ground against the object. This attitude, therefore, gives the subject a higher value than the object, and the object accordingly has a lower value. It is of secondary importance indeed. Sometimes the object represents no more than an outward token of a subjective content, the embodiment of an idea, the idea being the essential thing. If it is the embodiment of a feeling, then again the feeling is the main thing and not the object in its own right. It is clear here that the heart of an introverted preference is a placement of oneself as a higher priority than the object. The object being anything in the outer world, a person, a thing, an idea, a feeling, and these objects in the outer world sometimes representing nothing more than a projection of the introverted type's own subjective content. A preference for introversion then can be viewed, as Jung noted, as an inward turning of libido. In other words, a me-first mentality, not so much in a stereotypically selfish nature, but in an oriented towards oneself way. The introverted attitude is suggested here as placing more value on itself than the outer world. Of the extroverted attitude, Jung says, the extroverted standpoint, on the contrary, subordinates the subject to the object, so that the object has the higher value. In this case, the subject is of secondary importance, the subjective process appearing at times as no more than a disturbing or superfluous appendage of objective events. And so the extroverted attitude is one that places a higher value on objects in the outer world than it does on the subject or the person themselves. This then is essentially an outward turning of libido, as noted by Jung. It is an attitude of giving oneself to the outer world, an outer world first mentality, not in an I am worthless kind of way, but in an I am oriented towards the outer world kind of way. Although we all possess both introverted and extroverted mechanisms, we can never actually be precisely in the middle. There will always be a preference regardless of how slight, one way or another. Of this, Jung says, fantasy it was and ever is, which fashions the bridge between the irreconcilable claims of subject and object, introversion and extroversion. In fantasy alone, both mechanisms are united. Something important to note is that introversion and extroversion are not actually traits of character. Introversion is not merely being shy or reserved. Likewise, extroversion is not being hearty or gregarious. And so any and all stereotypes pertaining to introversion and extroversion have no place from a Jungian perspective. Jung notes the following: But as I've pointed out more than once, introversion and extroversion are not traits of character at all, but mechanisms, which can, as it were, be switched on or off at will. Only from their habitual predominance do the corresponding characters develop. So as we can hear, introversion and extroversion are not merely traits, but are indeed mechanisms, ones that we can switch on and off at will. What is important, the only determining factor, is which mechanism is more predominant, introversion or extroversion. Jung also notes that introversion and extroversion are not entirely dependent on any inborn disposition, but are indeed influenced by one's environment, like he says here. The predilection, one way or the other, no doubt depends on the inborn disposition, but this is not always the decisive factor. I have frequently found environmental influences to be just as important. In one case, in my experience, it even happened that a man with markedly extrovert behavior, while living in close proximity to an introvert, changed his attitude and became quite introverted when he later came into contact with a pronounced extroverted personality. I have repeatedly observed how quickly personal influences can alter the duration of the secondary function even in a well-defined type, and how the previous condition re-establishes itself as soon as the alien influence is removed. Jung outlines that there is no such thing as an introvert or an extrovert in the following. I would like to stress that each of the two general attitudes, introversion and extroversion, manifests itself in a special way in an individual through the predominance of one of the four basic functions. Strictly speaking, there is no introverts and extroverts pure and simple, but only introverted and extroverted function types, such as thinking types or sensation types. So therefore, it should be clear that there is no such thing as an introvert or an extrovert, rather there's introverted thinking types or extroverted sensation types, so on and so forth. The attitude manifests itself through the function. It does not manifest itself as an isolated thing, so to speak. So to summarize, introversion and extroversion are mechanisms that pertain to the orientation of a function. They are not their own separate entities. Each and every person possesses both mechanisms and alternates between them. So some simple definitions that I've come up with is: introversion is a placement of a higher value on one's own perspective and one's own self than on that of the outside influences and the outer world objects, things, people, ideas, etc. It's an orientation towards, or a more natural alignment with, one's own self or one's own experience and all the things within it. Extroversion is a placement of a higher value on the objective perspective and external things, people, objects, and ideas than on that of one's own personal perspective or self. It's an orientation towards, or a more natural alignment with, the objective outer world and all of the things within it. Despite introverted types pulling away from the object and preferring to orient themselves towards their own experience or perspectives, there's no restrictions or limitations being placed on how loud or gregarious these types may be, nor are there any regarding how forceful or aggressive these types can be. And so it wouldn't be anti-Jung to suggest the idea of somebody with a stereotypical and perhaps even accurate via the MBTI dichotomy E preference actually being a best fit for Jung's introverted attitude. Likewise, extroverted types leaning towards the object and preferring to orient themselves towards the objective outer world doesn't prevent them from being stereotypically introverted to the point that an I preference with regards to the MBTI dichotomy isn't the best fit. And it shouldn't require too large a stretch of the imagination to envision this as somebody that is so oriented towards the outer world, so interested in external happenings, so stimulated by other people's ideas, other opinions, other objects outside of themselves in their surrounding, that due to placing themselves of a lower value than all of this, they then keep their own subjective opinions and thoughts to themselves, deciding that they are not worthy of the outer world. So there you go, they'd be a dichotomy introvert by MBTI with an actual extroversion preference from a Jungian perspective. The reason for this is introversion and extroversion in MBTI land are absolutely nothing like Jung's introverted or extroverted types. It's absolutely possible to be a Jungian introverted type yet be an MBTI E, and vice versa. This difference, and applying the same concepts to the other dichotomies, sensing and intuition, thinking and feeling, they create a real divide with regards to perceiving and judging. It creates a real clash between the two models, and I'll get into that in future videos. That's it from me. TuriType, over and out.